It was now that the horror of his situation occurred to the boy with full force. But he resolved not to submit to his fate without a struggle, and realizing that he possessed the blue pearl, which gave him marvelous strength, he quickly broke the chains and set himself free of the handcuffs. Next he twisted the steel door from its hinges, and creeping along the short passage, found himself in the third cave. But now the dim light which had before guided him had vanished, yet on peering into the gloom of the cave he saw what appeared to be two round disks of flame, which cast a subdued glow over the floor and walls. By this dull glow he made out the form of an enormous man, seated in the center of the cave, and he saw that the iron grating had been removed, permitting the man to enter. The giant was unclothed, and its limbs were thickly covered with coarse red hair. The round disks of flame were its two eyes, and when it opened its mouth to yawn, Inga saw that its jaws were wide enough to crush a dozen men between the great rows of teeth. Presently, the giant looked up and perceived the boy crouching at the other side of the cavern, so he called out in a hoarse, rude voice, "Come hither, my pretty one. We will wrestle together, you and I, and if you succeed in throwing me, I will let you pass through my cave." The boy made no reply to the challenge. He realized he was in dire peril and regretted that he had lent the pink pearl to King Rinkitink. But it was now too late for vain regrets, although he feared that even his great strength would avail him little against this hairy monster. For his arms were not long enough to span a fourth of the giant's huge body, while the monster's powerful limbs would be likely to crush out Inga's life before he could gain the mastery. Therefore the prince resolved to employ other means to combat this foe, who had doubtless been placed there to bar his return. Retreating through the passage, he reached the room where he had been chained and wrenched the iron post from its socket. It was a foot thick and 4 feet long, and being of solid iron was so heavy that 3 ordinary men would have found it hard to lift. Returning to the cavern, the boy swung the great bar above his head and dashed it with mighty force full at the giant. The end of the bar struck the monster upon its forehead, and with a single groan it fell full length upon the floor and lay still. When the giant fell, the glow from its eyes faded away and all was dark. Cautiously, for Inga was not sure the giant was dead, the boy felt his way toward the opening that led to the middle cavern. The entrance was narrow and the darkness was intense, but, feeling braver now, the boy stepped boldly forward. Instantly the floor began to sink beneath him, and in great alarm he turned and made a leap that enabled him to grasp the rocky sides of the wall and regain a footing in the passage through which he had just come. Scarcely had he obtained this place of refuge when a mighty crash resounded throughout the cavern, and the sound of a rushing torrent came from far below. Inga felt in his pocket and found several matches, one of which he lighted and held before him. While it flickered, he saw that the entire floor of the cavern had fallen away, and knew that had he not instantly regained his footing in the passage, he would have plunged into the abyss that lay beneath him. By the light of another match, he saw the opening at the other side of the cave, and the thought came to him that possibly he might leap across the gulf. Of course, this could never be accomplished without the marvelous strength lent him by the blue pearl, but Inga had the feeling that one powerful spring might carry him over the chasm into safety. He could not stay where he was, that was certain, so he resolved to make the attempt. He took a long run through the first cave and the short corridor. Then, exerting all his strength, he launched himself over the black gulf of the second cave. Swiftly he flew, and, although his heart stood still with fear, only a few seconds elapsed before his feet touched the ledge of the opposite passageway, and he knew he had safely accomplished the wonderful feat. Only pausing to draw one long breath of relief, Inga quickly traversed the crooked corridor that led to the last cavern of the 3. But when he came in sight of it, he paused abruptly, his eyes nearly blinded by a glare of strong light which burst upon them. Covering his face with his hands, Inga retreated behind a projecting corner of rock, and by gradually getting his eyes used to the light, he was finally able to gaze without blinking upon the strange glare that had so quickly changed the condition of the cavern. When he had passed through this vault, it had been entirely empty. Now the flat floor of rock was covered everywhere with a bed of glowing coals, which shot up little tongues of red and white flames. Indeed, the entire cave was one monster furnace, and the heat that came from it was fearful. Inga's heart sank within him as he realized the terrible obstacle placed by the cunning Nome King between him and the safety of the other caverns. There was no turning back, for it would be impossible for him again to leap over the gulf of the second cave, the corridor at this side being so crooked that he could get no run before he jumped. Neither could he leap over the glowing coals of the cavern that faced him, for it was much larger than the middle cavern. In this dilemma, he feared his great strength would avail him nothing, and he bitterly reproached himself for parting with the pink pearl, which would have preserved him from injury. However, it was not in the nature of Prince Inga to despair for long. His past adventures having taught him confidence and courage, sharpened his wits, and given him the genius of invention. He sat down and thought earnestly on the means of escape from his danger, and at last a clever idea came to his mind. This is the way to get ideas: never to let adverse circumstances discourage you, but to believe there is a way out of every difficulty, which may be found by earnest thought. There were many points and projections of rock in the walls of the crooked corridor in which Inga stood, and some of these rocks had become cracked and loosened, although still clinging to their places. The boy picked out one large piece, and exerting all his strength, tore it away from the wall. He then carried it to the cavern and tossed it upon the burning coals, about 10 feet away from the end of the passage. Then he returned for another fragment of rock, and wrenching it free from its place, he threw it 10 feet beyond the first one, toward the opposite side of the cave. The boy continued this work until he had made a series of stepping stones, reaching straight across the cavern to the dark passageway beyond, which he hoped would lead him back to safety, if not to liberty. When his work had been completed, Inga did not long hesitate to take advantage of his stepping stones, for he knew his best chance of escape lay in his crossing the bed of coals before the rocks became so heated that they would burn his feet. So he leaped to the first rock, and from there began jumping from one to the other in quick succession. A withering wave of heat at once enveloped him, and for a time he feared he would suffocate before he could cross the cavern. But he held his breath to keep the hot air from his lungs and maintained his leaps with desperate resolve. Then, before he realized it, his feet were pressing the cooler rocks of the passage beyond, and he rolled helpless upon the floor, gasping for breath. His skin was so red that it resembled the shell of a boiled lobster, but his swift motion had prevented his being burned, and his shoes had thick soles which saved his feet. After resting a few minutes, the boy felt strong enough to go on. He went to the end of the passage and found that the rock door by which he had left his room was still closed. So he returned to about the middle of the corridor and was thinking what he should do next, when suddenly the solid rock before him began to move, and an opening appeared through which shone a brilliant light. Shielding his eyes, which were somewhat dazzled, Inga sprang through the opening and found himself in one of the Nome King's inhabited caverns, where before him stood King Calico with a broad grin upon his features, and Click, the king's chamberlain, who looked surprised, and King Rinkitink, seated astride Bilbil the goat, both of whom seemed pleased that Inga had rejoined them. End of chapter 18.